so excited to be here today and share this panel with this fantastic colleague I've met a couple of months ago, and it's amazing what you are doing. Like me, you share this passion for data and data democratization. It's a buzzword, or is this something that we really need? We will discover that in our panel. So data, first of all, we have seen today with these fantastic talks, our community are creating data, and data science is the bridge, is what allows us to build community, connect community. So I would like to start with, oh my goodness, I was running, I would like to start from learning from you, who are your community? Who do you represent? What is the community or the communities you are part of? And what is your role? And we start with Priya, and then we move, with Nikki, my goodness, and then Priya, and then Julie.
Yeah, so there's many titles that I hold right now and how people associate me with different institutions, one being a doctoral candidate at the University of Arizona, next working with the Bay Area Environmental Research Institute, and lastly working with NASA Ames Research Center. But out of all of those introductions or titles that I might hold, one of the things that really holds the most importance for me is being recognized as an Indigenous woman research scientist, and that really identifies the communities that I work with. So yat e she Nikki Tulley and she torijin in the shlon takut egot and then sun shlen. So what I shared with you is my name is Nikki Tulley, and I come from the Navajo Nation, and I'm recognized as Bitterwater, a woman in my community, and we're a matrilineal society. And so all the work that I do has really stemmed from a lived experience in working with the indigenous communities that I now work with. And not long ago, in institutions like this and many others, you might have heard of the residential schools and the boarding school era, where we weren't allowed to wear anything related to identity or speak our language in any form. And so I think that is a motivation and a passion that has led me into the work of data science and working in the communities that I do. And so understanding that history and looking at the community and the empowerment that comes from creating data scientists within the communities. My area of focus is water science and looking at remote sensing. And so the ultimate goal being to allow communities and people within those indigenous communities that I work with to feel comfortable and develop that relationship with being trustful of the data that is out there, whether that's data coming from the outside or being extracted, but finding that balance to create this symbiotic opportunity in data science.
Thank you, Nikki. Priya, what is your community? What is your role in your community?
Yeah, so you did hear from me just now, but basically I would say, I'm both an academic, kind of, again, doing this research on machine learning and power systems, as well as I kind of identify with, being a nonprofit founder, right? Somebody who's really trying to build something for the collective good and really bring together people from different communities to work on a common challenge. And the challenge in this case is climate change. And so I got into working on climate change because back in high school, actually, I had a teacher who dedicated the first week of the biology class that everybody was required to take to actually a sustainability and climate-related curriculum. And when we learned about climate change, the thing that really struck me at the time is I think a lot of times before that it had been framed as sort of, an issue of, an environmental issue. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense and is super important. But I think for the first time, it was also framed to me as a human issue and as one where human and environment really are connected and both really being affected by this. And so as somebody who is the kind of child of immigrants to the US and grew up visiting India, where my parents are from, growing up, I think seeing these inequities in the world and really internalizing the fact that these inequities exist, I think really then drove me to say, well, if climate change is going to exacerbate them, we really have to do something about this. And so I'd say kind of bridging, the academic and nonprofit communities, the climate change and machine learning data science communities, but then also I think bringing that kind of experience as, again, the child of immigrants into it. I think all of these kind of shape my approach to the things I work on.
Thank you so much. And Julie?
Yes, so our OpenScapes community is really exciting and wonderful. There's a lot of environmental and earth scientists, and when I was first thinking about OpenScapes, the focus was really on academic lab groups and thinking about folks of really my cohort going into leading academic labs, and if they had never been included in data science or kind of these open practices, what were their labs, why would their labs be any different than what they'd seen from years before? And so there's new tech, new ideas and practices around inclusion, and how do we welcome more folks to have those skills and resources? So it's been really exciting to work with academics, and then more and more we're working with government, and that's been just a wonderful surprise and exciting thing, and that's in large part to my partner Aaron Robinson, when we work together with NASA and also with our fisheries scientists partners. And I think that like seeing institutional change and culture change happen is just like the most amazing thing. Like I can't really even describe it articulately at the moment, but to see folks say like, you know, I've been feeling stuck for years and I didn't know how to talk about it. I didn't know how to change that. But this, you know, I can feel this change now, and that's really exciting. And I think artwork is a big part of our welcome to open data science, and partnering with Allison Horst, who's an amazing artist, to really bring the feelings of like, you know, you can have a Luke Skywalker moment or a sad animal moment, and that is normal, it's okay, it's part of this landscape, and how do we like recognize that and help welcome you further? Yeah.
Thank you. So the topic of our panel is data democratization. And it is something that we read about data democratization more and more, I think, this idea of open access to the data, easy access to the data. So what is the status of data democratization in your community? Is it a work in progress? Is it still a buzzword? Is it something that is almost accomplished? Tell us a little bit about, and perhaps we can start from Priya.
Yeah, so I'd say data democratization in the climate change space is very heterogeneous. Of course, climate change affects virtually every sector across society, so you can imagine this looks different in different sectors. But I think there are a couple of kind of key ingredients to what data democratization really means that come up when we approach this. So one of them is that it's not just about the literal data, it's about the capacity, right? Who holds the money, skills, expertise, ability to really collect, monitor, evaluate, sustain data that is collected and use data that is out there. And I think this kind of the democratization of capacity building and really making sure that a wider range of people, institutions, geographies have access to these kinds of skills is extremely important. Another one is making sure that data democratization isn't conflated with always just one-for-one the notion of open data. Open data is indeed very important, but I think it's important to look to things like the Indigenous Care Principles, which articulate basically how it's both that data needs to be put out for the collective benefit, but also the ability of the people whose data it is to actually have autonomy and control over why is that out there, when, how do those communities really get to benefit from the fact that the data is out there, thinking through these aspects of basically both openness but also dignity with respect to whose data it is become really important. And then the fact that it's not just literal data that we would do machine learning on, but also data about the community and network and who is able to come together to do this work. Because often a lot of, even rooms like this, I think WIDS has done a really fantastic job bringing together people from a lot of places, but I think there's more that needs to be done to really make sure that truly everyone around the world is able to access communities like this and really benefit from communities like this. And so I think data about the network and data about the community is also a really important part of thinking about what it means to democratize data.
Julia.
Yeah, no, Priya, I agree so much. I think where I think about it a lot is around skills. I think we think about data democratization often about the thing, the data, so the products, but the process of data democratization and who has the skills to participate is a big deal. So I think time to learn, like paid time to learn, has been a huge theme with us. And that's, I think, why NASA OpenScapes is so exciting, is that NASA is leading open science initiatives and spearheading this 2023 as the year of open science. And as part of that, I think that sort of high-level policy towards open science has enabled managers across these NASA Earth Data Centers to allow their staff to give 8 hours or more per month towards learning towards OpenScapes. At the California Water Board, some of our partners spend a day a week teaching and learning and supporting their communities at work. So like making learning and peer teaching part of their paid jobs, which is super exciting. And I think, I mentioned identity before, like identity as a data scientist. I think identity as mentors and teachers is like such a huge part of this too, because all of us, many of us, I'll say, in the environmental science community are self-taught. We'd identify as self-taught, and with that comes with this idea of like, therefore I'm not an expert to teach someone else. And it's like, no, we're all on the forefront. Like we can all teach something, and you can learn from something from everyone as well. So I think that like the missing piece is the skills and saying that it takes time and it can't be automated. We saw that beautiful example this morning of code review, like spending time together to look at code together. Like that's a big part of this learning process, and experimenting and taking time. And we really think about this as like slowing down to speed up, right? Like this will take more time now, but we'll be able to speed up together soon.
Thank you. Nikki, what about your community, and what does it mean, data democratization?
Yes, I think hand in hand with data democratization, that has to be considered with the communities I work in, is also what Priya just touched on with the principles component, is really understanding the data sovereignty component as well, and understanding that, yes, I work with communities, but a lot of them are sovereign nations, and so what are the laws and structures that are needed to be built into some of the data access, the data education, and what that looks like. And when we're talking about equity, or we're talking about access and education, or we're talking about the different levels of understanding of technical backgrounds that are working with this data, I think it's important to understand that there's a huge diversity of communities when we talk about data access. And in my instance, when I talk about data access, it might be different from some, where some people, that data access starts with the pushing of a keystroke on a keyboard, whereas a lot of the communities that I work with, it goes back even a step further of looking at structural infrastructure. So looking at the groundbreaking levels of creating internet access, whereas it's not just a luxury to have internet, but how does that become part of a household to be able to create that opportunity for access and education. And that's where I think it is now, is that building of capacity, like Priya just talked about, like that capacity building component is really important towards this co-development and collaboration of this opportunity now with data and the democratization thereof.
What a great set of ideas, and really enlightening to us what does it mean, data democratization, for different community, but there is a lot of overlapping in our needs and also in what we share across our community. So we go to the big point of this panel, which is sustainability, and sustainability for community through data democratization. And so I would like to start from Julia this time, and let's define what is indeed sustainable community, and whether indeed data democratization is the mean or one of the means for such an important component. So let's start with the concept of sustainability in communities.
Yeah, no, and sustainability in community, it takes so many levels, right? Like the personal sustainability, so that your daily life is in balance. You're not working, 20 hours a day or whatnot. But also looking out for each other and thinking about resilience within teams, like concentric teams, I think is one way to think about it. I think our one example I can give is our very first teaching event that we led with the NASA mentors. Folks had spent the whole summer learning GitHub, learning Jupyter notebooks, in order to teach them, learning teaching approaches, figuring out how to be in our Jupyter Hub, like all these pieces. And then when we taught and also had done code review and feedback about teaching, and in our first teaching event, we had 65 folks logged into our Jupyter Hub from across the whole country using NASA Earth data on the cloud. It was super exciting. And one of our first teachers wasn't able to be there with an emergency. And another mentor said, I can do it. I've seen him teach it. I can do it, you know? And it was like that kind of like resilience and sustainability, like, and that feeling of like, now we can do more together and come, you know, with ebbs and flows of people's capacity and life. Like, I think building these kind of resilient systems across teams is really exciting.
Wonderful, wonderful examples. Nikki, what about you? What is data democratization enabling and for sustainability purposes?
Yeah, so in the sustainability component, I think, again, going back to the diversity of the different communities, just one indigenous scientist, I can't speak for all different tribal nations that are out there, over the 500 federally recognized tribes, but like particularly focusing on the community I come from, there's this concept that we believe in called Sa'at. Essentially that goes to this core fundamental belief of Hajon, which is this underlying principle of creating a harmonious type of living. And so we can, in looking at what like the essence of data democratization that I am familiar with, of creating access, creating education, and at that different level of ability in relation to the data, that type of teaching that I'm familiar with breaks it down to looking at every single living being has a reason for existing in this environment. So whether it's the tiniest little ant walking across the landscape, that just has as much purpose and reason for existing as a human being. And so I think in creating that conduit type of knowledge exchange is something that is important, that is coming out even more in that these principles were already existing for millennia in a lot of the communities I work with, but it was just a form of understanding that connection in different ways of terminology and thought process that is now coming together and is being addressed more apparently with this capacity building component now in understanding what data is meaning to different groups that are working together, breaking down those silos.
Thank you, thank you. Priya.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think this aspect of both like putting together data democratization and capacity democratization are absolutely important to building sustainable communities. And I think it's important to think through, you know, how do we shape societal incentives to make sure that these things actually happen? So, for example, a company that maybe is a solutions provider for machine learning in climate, right? They may have the incentive to basically try to bring business into their own company, right? And so they might grow their own company, they might train people to bring into their company. But even if sort of, you know, aside from the question of should one company or one entity, you know, from an ethical perspective then serve the, you know, whether one company should really centralize that power, there's this question of how big can really one entity be and still do this work in a really like on the ground, very informed manner. And so I think it's worth thinking through what are the kind of societal incentives around democratization, and some of these do in some sense run counter to democratization, and how do we make that happen? I think democratization is also important, not just from a supplier side, but also from a kind of consumer side. So if you are, for example, an NGO or a small government that doesn't have in-house capacity in data science, but wants to employ data science for climate action, you might go to a solutions provider. But if your needs shift, if there's some reason you don't want to work with that solutions provider anymore, if there isn't sort of, you know, a choice there in terms of who your supplier is, then that can lock in these entities to, you know, higher prices or the whims of their solutions provider. And so I think the democratization kind of is important from that kind of choice perspective, and ensuring that entities aren't kind of captured by or locked into the interests of other entities. And I think that kind of interoperability, making sure that different, you know, standards exist such that you can really switch suppliers and can switch these things, becomes important then as well.
And I was listening to you and I was seeing that you all are putting together a puzzle, a little bit of the business model. Some of you point out the importance, for example, Julia, you point out the importance of government agency. Priya, you point out the aspect of engaging company. And Nikki, you are pointing out the importance of putting the human being and the tradition. So I would like to put you on the spot and say, what is the business model that you think can take us to have a sustainable community and data democratization, keeping in mind that companies have to survive, have to have a profit, government has limit in the resources, and human being has have tradition that sometimes are hard to preserve or to respect. So why don't I start from you, Nikki, and you tell me what is the business model that could meet all these needs, if there is one?
Yeah, I think if in talking like along the business line component, I think it's the human connection and understanding the value of data and what it represents is something to be considered. And so whether in the communities that I work with, oftentimes the capacity building in the area of remote sensing, not necessarily as for the monetary reasons, but for the conservations or the continuing of way of life. And so how to use data in different contexts, or how to define monetary reasons or business models in different contexts, and what's the purpose of data, and finding the relevance of whatever model you're using to fit the needs of the community, I think is important. And I feel like the opportunity is there in looking at how for example, I just met with a tribal leader on the airport right here, and he mentioned that, oh, you're a scientist, that's interesting. I like how you are indigenous and you understand these things, but with your scientific mindset and the learnings that you're now, do you still see a pile of rocks just as a pile of rocks, or do you see the value in that and what it means to the community? And he was from a different tribe, and so it brought to this realization of what is that model in creating the diversity of thought to coexist together, and understanding that there's this traditional ecological knowledge framework that is in line with the Western education scientific methodology. And I think when the two come together, that could be considered some sort of model in the business relation of the inputs and the deliverables to come to the communities.
Yeah, very inspiring. Julia, what about your vision of this business model?
Yeah. I wonder, think about the flywheel again, how it's not just one thing, but many little things that play together. So I wonder too, just the idea that not everything scales at the same rate. So when we think about movement building and thinking about open science and data science in the space, we look to movements like Get Out the Vote movement. That's something where there's local efforts, sharing knowledge, both on financial sides and on strategy and on people, and really using kind of the same tools, if you ballots, or if you think I don't know how far this analogy goes, but like there's small efforts on the ground that are learning together, and not reinventing everywhere. It's not only one big thing, but I think that that's kind of the business model or learning model that comes to mind.
Fascinating, this overlapping between business model and learning model. Priya.
Yeah, so I guess one kind of model that exists for example, what a single entity might look like that's doing this. There are some models that kind of fall in between what a kind of nonprofit or a for-profit entity would look like. So you're starting to see, for example, high growth tech nonprofits or high growth climate nonprofits where the entity is actually structured as a nonprofit, but you wouldn't necessarily think of that if you saw them. They operate like a business, they sell services, they do various things, that money comes back. Similarly, there are many entities that are cooperatively owned. The ownership of the company and the profits really flow back to the membership. And there are various ways to basically align kind of the societal good of the entity and where the money flows, so that you don't have an entity that's focused on infinite growth, but one that's focused on how do I create benefit, how do I do this while generating revenue, and how do I invest that revenue back into the mission of the organization and the kind of communities and the people who are both part of the organization and who are served by it. And so I think these kinds of like self-sustaining, kind of cyclic, almost like entities where you have the revenues coming in and they're really going back to serve the mission and the people rather than necessarily focusing on, you know, an entity that has to infinitely grow year on year and the profits sort of get funneled off to some anonymous people. I think these are some models that I think are underrated and should be explored more in our kind of mainstream when we start companies.
Thank you. So we are in a very diverse community here to the Women in Data Science Conference, very diverse in terms of disciplines, in terms of geographical region where we live, where we contribute. So in the last 4 minutes of this panel, 1 minute each of you, I would like to know how can we be part of this vision of democratization and sustainable community through data science. And I would like to start from Nikki again. So how can we become data scientists that embrace this vision and contribute to your community and our communities?
Yeah, I feel like as scientists or anybody like in academia or in a level where people kind of listen to you because they think you're intelligent and they kind of discredit themselves a little bit more. I come from a community where they feel it's like oftentimes represented as underrepresented, and there's always this opportunity where people say we need more voices in these communities, but the reality is these voices have already been there, but we've been hogging the mic. And so I think it's time for us to pass the mic to let these other people amplify their voices, to really create that education, that access, and welcoming those at different levels of technology. And I feel like that is really that opportunity to connect community to end user and whatever type of data access or data creation that we're thinking about.
Fantastic. Julia.
Yeah, I think something we can all do is reflect on our assumptions of ourselves and of others, and maybe ask more questions so that we break down those assumptions. I think there's a lot of assumptions around what tech people know or don't know, and what skills they have. And I think one thing you can also do is role model openness in different ways. So screen sharing is a great way to role model openness. Showing somebody like, oh, I just figured out this keyboard shortcut, like that's gonna save, like I think that's cool. Or also if someone's describing their challenge, if you ask them to screen share and have role modeled that sort of safe place for them to do that, you can help solve problems in ways and build that culture that they can pass forward to.
Thank you. Priya.
Yeah, and I guess I'd add, on a structural level, I think understanding, how our current structures create inertia towards kind of solutions and money and data kind of being used more so for certain groups than others, and understanding really how to fight that inertia intentionally becomes important. So thinking about, for example, when we have sponsored research at universities, sponsorship is money. So whose problems end up getting solved, right? People who have the money to sponsor research. Are there things we can do to actually combat that and kind of work with stakeholders who don't have that kind of money and resource and channel some of that money towards stakeholders who don't in some sorts monetarily pass the mic. And then in addition, thinking about things like who is at job fairs, right? Similarly, people pay in to get to job fairs. Can we go to our universities and really ask, can we make slots available for entities that are coming from different places and are coming from different resources, and let our students see them, interact with them, and potentially go work with them? So I think really seeing where are existing structures, creating some kind of inertia that's moving resources towards entities that are already resourced, and figuring out how can we make sure that others are able to more fundamentally be part of that as well. Yeah.
Fantastic. I'm learning so much from you, and I hope that you all have been also learning from our fantastic panelists. And I think that you are also telling us that we have to embrace and be courageous, being able to go out and also teach, learn, communicate, respect, because that is also part of data science. One word to define your passion for data science. Just one word, and then we will finish the Nikki.
Collaboration.
Impact.
Kindness.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Please join me to thank our fantastic panelists.